This is Fergus Hodgson, publisher of the Impunity Observer. Thanks for tuning in to our monthly podcast or monthly interview. We have a weekly podcast, and monthly we get a special guest. This month we have Santiago Carranco, and he is part of the permanent seminar with RELIAL. And this is a network of classical, liberal, or just liberal, if you want to use the word correctly, organizations throughout Latin America promoting the rule of law, free markets, limited government. And I've been to a couple of their conferences before. This is a useful network. And they've set up a permanent seminar to examine the role of China in Latin America. And anyone who cares about the future prosperity of Latin America needs to zero in or learn about the Chinese influence, because it comes with many implications. And in some ways, the Chinese are filling a vacuum that has been left by a withering U.S. presence, maybe, if we can put it that way, or as the U.S. declines economically, it leaves space for the Chinese to come in. Now, Santiago is an international relations professor at the International University of Ecuador, or UIDE, and he holds a PhD in international studies from Fluxo, which is a sociology university across Latin America. Okay, his particular paper, as part of a broader project put on by RELIAL, focuses on the COVID and post-COVID role of China in Peru and Ecuador. He's based in Quito, Ecuador. So, Santiago, welcome to the show, and please explain to us what was the catalyst for this broader project, and how did you join the broader series of research projects that apparently are ongoing, that have not finished with these 6 or 7.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Fergus. For me, it's a major pleasure to be here. And thanks for referring to the RELIAL permanent seminar. I mean, its roots is an academic root that we definitely see that there was this necessity of generating more academic papers, more academic visions, more academic analysis about the situation of China in Latin America. China has been a great investor in a lot of projects across Latin America. It could be like infrastructure projects or development projects, or literally just a financial investor for political projects. This is what we could see in Argentina. Yeah, we have a lot of opinions, we have a lot of columns, we have a lot of daily information about this process. But what the seminar, the RELIAL seminar of relations between China and America Latina wants to do is to generate an academic discussion, and this means to order all this information and get a more precisely and peer review data that we could use for making better, for doing better policymaking, or especially for continuing all these studies. So that's why we are part of this seminar. And as you just said, we just have our first publication that it recognized the 6 works, the 6 analysis, academic analysis of renowned academics from across all Latin America. And I, especially with my colleague Maria Virginia Villacres, we focus in this part that was what happened with China and what happened with China and the relations with these 2 countries in the Andean region, Peru of Ecuador. And basically what we saw is quite interesting, because we focus in this international political economy theory of Susan Strange, that is called the British School. And it says that actually in the international system, we just don't have to watch the armies and the military powder, but we have to focus in 4 main structures. These structures are the economic, the financial, the politics, and the knowledge. So based on this theory, we try to analyze how is the influence of China in Latin America across these 4 main structures. And what we see is really interesting, because since the 80s, we know this process is well detailed in a lot of papers. China has started to be like a major competitor in the productive realm across the world. And what is interesting is that China don't use these gains, these financial gains, to actually improve the life of the well condition of its people. I mean, it's undeniable that the conditions and the well-being of its people is better from 20 years ago, but they could actually do a little bit more. But instead, their strategy has been to start buying international bonds, start buying international currency, start investing, especially in these financial products or these financial bonds from other countries. And what we see, especially in the COVID, is that China has this zero COVID policy that make that a lot of factories, a lot of services, a lot of factories in China, they just have to close. So the question is how China, what was the strategy of China to recover after all this? And what we see is that they use these financial products that they hold, and they could have this year of basically zero production. But in the next years, post-pandemic, the growth of China in terms of in economic terms was major. This is in comparison or in contrast to the strategy used by the United States or Europe, that they just use this strategy of printing money. And we know that the secret cost of just printing money is the inflation. So in these post-COVID years, we've seen that China has a great recovery. They don't have inflation, and they recover all these financial assets that they use for liquidity in these times of COVID. But United States and Europe, their strategy are affecting right now because they have a lot of this inflation. So what is interesting here is that when we see this recovery of China and they have these financial assets and they start growing again, they could use this financial power and commercial power to actually go into politics. And one of the major things that we have seen in Ecuador and in Peru, for example, is that Peru never lent loan money from China. But after COVID, they start to lending money from China. And Ecuador just signed a free trade agreement with China. And we could talk about this later because they have a lot of secret implications, not just commercial ones.
Yeah, so that one element of your report, which I found insightful, was that China somehow managed to basically turn COVID-19 to its benefit, that their economy grow, and they basically got many vaccine patents to their name. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I will say that the major winner of COVID-19 was China. But in any case, I am saying that China produced this COVID crisis. There's no evidence about that.
Yeah, we're not, that's not necessarily, they don't necessarily go together.
Perfect. Yeah. So yeah, I think it's a major winning, but because of the strategy that they implement. But this is not a strategy plan based on COVID. I think that this strategy is a reflection of what China has been doing since the 80s. What
do you mean since the 80s?
I mean, we know that China changed its model since the 80s. They tried to manage this social model or more centralized, controlled model at the domestic realm. But at the international realm, they just portrayed that this free trade and improved commercial country. You could actually use this to get financial assets. And that's what China was doing. If we see at the beginning or before the 2008 crisis, the first country that holds more bonds of the United States, besides the United States, obviously, was the Vatican. But the third one was China. So we could see that all these gains from its production process for maintaining its currency devaluated, for maintaining its cost of jobs devaluated, those don't return into policies that improves the well-being of people. Instead, they just try to gain these financial assets. But this is not like a thing that, oh, okay, China is so bad because they don't return its winnings to its people and for domestic policies and for development. No, it's because it has like a impediment of materialistic relations. Imagine if just China tomorrow they use all these winnings and a lot of Chinese people go into the middle class. We don't have resources in the world for this demand. So actually, I think was smart, not just for China in these moments, but actually for the world. This doesn't mean that China continues in this way. Maybe in 10 years, in 20 years, a lot of Chinese people goes into middle class, has more consumption power, and we're actually going to see its effects directly in the world. So back into to the question, this was the strategy. The strategy was in the COVID, during the COVID pandemic, they used these financial assets. They transformed this into liquidity. They just stopped the COVID. And when the COVID has gone from China, they actually don't lose these dynamics of the economy because all that liquidity was there. So it just took 1 year from recovery, from all this recovery. And yeah, it's interesting because since United States and Europe was struggling with these internal problems, with inflation problems, China was fine. And this was the moment, or I think actually this is going to be the moment that this financial and economic leverage that they have start to turning into politics. And this is how we starting to see this influence, especially in Ecuador and in Peru.
There's a lot to unpack, but what you said that the trade agreement with Ecuador and the debt with Peru, these two actions come with less visible entanglements or implications. What are those implications?
Yeah, this is definitely going to be our next analysis, our next investigation. But yeah, of course, we see in Ecuador that the negotiations for this free trade agreement, they just last 6 months. And we could say, oh, it is a real efficiency from our diplomats and the Chinese diplomacy to get this free trade agreement so fast. But actually not. I mean, when you negotiate with a great economic potency like China, you have to be really meticulous in these implications that you have. And what we actually signed was a traditional free trade agreement. What does this mean? That we don't put environmental issues, we don't take into account labor issues, we don't take into account human rights, we don't take into account a lot of things, a lot of topics. So we have a classic trade agreement from the 80s. What are these implications? And I'm going to give a quick example. For example, we have a free trade agreement with Europe. In this free trade agreement with Europe, we could not sell, for example, chocolate or cocoa beans from zones that have environmental impact. But in China, we don't have this restriction. So what could happen in the future economic relations? That a lot of local producers that they, in their costs, they have all these environmental regulations, they start to preferring to sell to China, that they don't put all these environmental restrictions. And what is going to happen in 20 years? In 20 years, when we are used not to have these environmental implications, these labor implications, we're going to be like lazy industries that we could only sell to China. We could not enter into markets of the United States, of Europe. And there is this possible danger that if we depend so much from our negotiations with China and our local producers depends so much on the Chinese market, we actually, or China could actually start saying, okay, we have to vote, I don't know, in pro from some dispute that have China with Taiwan, I'm just guessing, in favor of China. But if we don't vote in favor of China, they could just say, okay, your cocoa beans actually are not suitable for this market, so we are going to put a restriction of them. So that's how, after this, I think the financial relations and the economic relations could be start going into the political realm.
Yeah, what it means is that domestically, Ecuador can behave in ways that the European Union and the United States would not accept.
Most dangerous could be this laziness in local production. Don't try to go for example, in the environment. We start to producing with no environmental restrictions. So this could be actually a danger, not just for our productions, but actually well for our biosphere, right? For our country.
So not only does the Chinese engagement facilitate suboptimal incentives in Ecuador, there is a degree of leverage that the Chinese dictatorship, or what do you want to call the regime there, they get leverage over Ecuador in the international relations sphere.
Not now, not now, but I think we don't have this information right now. This is just an hypothesis, but for explaining this point, is that our next investigation, maybe in the same seminar, is going to be about the long-term effects of this free trade agreement with China. What I have to say is that if we read the agreement, it's quite interesting because in the first 5 years, China has a lot of restrictions to Ecuador, but Ecuador we start to more than 100 products we could just send to China right now with no taxes. In the first 5 years for Ecuadorian producers and local producers, this is really benefit. It's incredible benefit. But in the 6 year, in the 10 years, in the 15 years, and the 20 years, in the long terms, when we just start depending on this Chinese market or this, for example, what is the main products that China export to Ecuador? They are cell phones, they are cars,
Yes.
and they are these, I could say like things for informatical and technological infrastructure. This is quite interesting because in Ecuador, we have this security system that is called the ECU 1911, is made from China. So if we start to depend all this technological infrastructure as well from China, this is another point of leverage for them. Here goes to another great debate that is going to be who is going to implement the 5G technology, for example, in Ecuador. Is going to implement Chinese companies, going to implement European companies, United States companies, and all its implications. But with this free trade agreement, right now, or not right now, but in 10 years, it's going to be more easy or more cheap as well that China implement these systems in all Ecuador. So as I said before, there are a lot of implications that could not be bad for Ecuador, but they need to be known. They need to be socialized with all the community of Ecuador to start understanding this implication. And if we actually agree with this implication, it's not just a commercial free trade agreement as we portray it. This commercial free trade agreement going to have impact directly in our political and our social situation later.
Yeah, so the implication is that in the short run, there's likely an economic boost from this trade.
Definitely.
But the institutional risks are higher on a longer term or a midterm basis. And
Definitely.
it appears that your report is basically observational, documenting what has happened and not prescriptive. You have not sought to say we should do this or there should be a certain policy put in place. That is correct. That you've sort of just be observational. Just detail what has happened and let people make their own conclusions.
Definitely, definitely. I mean, we don't have the information actually to say this is going to happen and negotiating with China is bad, uh, but we have to have clear information. And yes, this is important to say, as we have seen before, from China, for example, in how they act. They have acted in some Caribbean countries is okay. We invest in infrastructure projects, but later they comes with okay, we invest here, but we have to accept the one China policy. And we are seeing that a lot of countries that have relations with Taiwan, for example, now are changing the relations with China and start not recognizing Taiwan as a free country. I mean, we have a lot of this in the past. And that's exactly what I'm trying to say here. Yeah, now we have a free trade agreement. Now we have boosted our economic and financial relations with China, but there is going to be the political price here. It's going to be a political cost, sorry, here. And we have to be concerned about this situation because maybe the Equatorians doesn't want this. But if this is a hidden cost, we really need to inform to the people. So actually, yeah, as you said, this is
Mm.
not a prescriptive recipe of what we have to do. This is just awareness observation.
Do you perceive there to be rising awareness in Peru and Ecuador that this engagement with China will come at a price? And are people pushing back and saying we should either be neutral or align more with the United States or align more heavily with OAS rather than CELAC? Is there an awareness that we're cornering ourselves long term?
I think there is not any awareness right now. It's
Right.
interesting because the ex-commerce ministry was actually the main interested in this sign of free trade agreement with China. So the actual Ministry of Production, they just, we don't hear the voice. So this response actually, and it's well known that this ex-ministry work, especially for some commercial chambers here. So there's another problem that we have just here in Ecuador, that normally we use the state for individual gains or purposes, but it's well known that in Latin America we do this. So in this case, sometimes we sell these agreements, and not just the Chinese agreement, a lot of agreements as something good, as something that is going to benefit to our population, but actually is just benefit to some special groups. So in this case, I really think that the seminar, for example, for RELIAL, what is doing is raising awareness of this situation, is raising awareness that we need more information, and we need to start studying these diplomatic, economic, financial relations with China, but because they are not similar of what we are used to. We negotiating with
Mm.
China is not the same of negotiating with Europe, and is not the same of negotiating with United States, or is not the same negotiating in the intra-community countries. So we really need to start understanding that there are different situations, and start understanding that maybe some political factors that we're going to see in the future, they are not what all the Ecuadorians and all the Peruvians agreed for, but we have to start thinking about this. Just for making a parenthesis here, there's in the same book, in the same publication, there is a chapter specifically for this Confucius Center that we could see there more like the soft power. I try to engage into the hard power, the economic power, but more in the soft power that as well start having a lot of influence in China. Actually, in our paper, we see how each year more Latin American students are going to Chinese university for getting these master's degrees or getting their doctoral degrees. So each year this statistic is growing up. So we have this. We are just want to raise awareness about this.
Okay. If you want to read the full paper by Santiago Carranco, please go to the show notes, which will be below this if you're watching on YouTube or on impunityobserver.com. if you want to go to the original site where we have the audio and other video platforms. And you can also follow him on Twitter or X. It is at @SCarancoP, and we'll have that link there in the show notes also. Now, I appreciate your time, and I wanted is there anything that I didn't touch upon or you didn't touch upon you think that the audience members just need to know about this evolution of Chinese engagement with Ecuador and Peru?
I just think that not just in Ecuador and Peru, I think that China is a major player today, and
Yes.
we have to be aware of this and start understanding what is doing not just in the macro level of the countries, but as well in the small cities with the civil society and all these groups. I mean, we really have to be aware of this
Mm.
situation and start to engaging more in this Chinese Latin American literature, as well in the Chinese African literature that we have, because there are another examples of how the infrastructure then it has more political implications. So I think this is going to be the reflection, start following more our jobs from the seminar. As well, we are going to have more publications, more analysis, and not just from our seminar, from some diverse voices that we're going to hear across Latin America.
That is true. Other parts of the world are further down the path than Ecuador and Peru or Latin America, more broadly speaking. Okay, Santiago, a pleasure to meet you. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much for your time as well, and to the Impunity Observer for the invitation.